Welcome to this presentation, which is intended for anybody thinking about whether or not they should stand for the general election to the House of Keys in September of 2026. My name is Peter Edge. I'm a Professor of Law at Oxford Brookes University, and the other voice you'll hear during this presentation is that of my colleague, Dr. Katrina Mackay, who's a lecturer at the University College in the Isle of Man. It's worth stressing that neither of us is associated with a political party, or Tynwald, or the Elections Office. So how did we get into this? Well, together with another colleague, Dr. Alex Powell, we carried out a project looking at the experiences of women in MANX politics from 1919 to the present. We looked at historical data, election data, and crucially for tonight, we interviewed a significant number of women who had become MHKs, run to become MHKs, or had considered becoming an MHK and then decided why not. And it's really on the back of that research, that experience of talking with people about their choice to stand for the keys, that we developed the presentation you'll see now. Now, this presentation was originally delivered in the Isle of Man in person, and our plan was to stream it live on the night and make the streaming recording available for other people to catch up on as they wished. I'm afraid due to technical problems that didn't work out, so we've had to record a separate version of the presentation. What we did in the night, we talked about what MHKs do. We did a bit of myth busting, exploring some of the myths around how you get to be an MHK. Then we had a coffee break, during which people got a chance to talk to each other. Then we talked about the process by which the women we'd spoken to had decided to run for the keys, some tips on how to run for the keys, and then finally we finished with some links to the wide variety of resources there are out there to help with your decision making. I'm afraid the coffee break we can't offer in this recording. You'll have to fix that for yourself, but otherwise we've tried to make it as similar as possible to what we did on the night. So our first topic is, what do MHKs do? You're thinking about possibly going through the process to become a member of the House of Keys. What is the work that they do? What's the experience of being an MHK? Because that will obviously inform your decision whether or not to stand. So we're going to start with what you probably think of as the central work of a member of the House of Keys, which is actually being in the keys, being in the chamber, either sitting in the House of Keys as a distinct body, or sitting in Tynwald Court, which is when members of the House of Keys and members of the Legislative Council all sit together. The House of Keys is really the central powerhouse of the MANX Constitution today, and so it has extraordinarily wide powers. It legislates. No Act of Tynwald can be passed without a majority of the keys, and most legislation now starts in the keys. It appoints. The Chief Minister is appointed by the keys, and the Council of Ministers can be removed by the keys. So it has a really big role in appointing and holding to account executive government. It approves. It votes on a very wide range of government actions, approves regulations, etc. from government departments. And it's a centre for public debate. I think it's probably the central location for debate over public policy and public concerns, either in the keys or as part of Tynwald Court. Keeping the focus on the work in the chamber, it's worth being aware just how varied that work can be. On a sitting day chosen at random, Tynwald dealt with sanctions against Belarus, a review of social care, funding of a public swimming pool, the Chief Constable's annual report, government handling of a high-profile tribunal case, an interim report on footpaths, banks being removed from towns and villages, and the central bus station in Douglas. And of course, a day in chamber will involve considerably more work in preparation. A sense of the bundle that an MHK has to go through can be gained by looking at the agenda for a sitting at the Keys or Tynwald, which is available on the Tynwald website, and then clicking through the links to read the papers that they will have read in preparation for the debates. So even in the chamber, there's a lot more than debating and voting on acts of Tynwald. It's a very, very diverse and busy caseload. But there is much more to being an MHK than work actually in the chamber when it's sitting and preparing for such work. You have constituents. You have individuals who voted for you or didn't vote for you, for whom you're responsible for representing. And Daphne Kane in 2021, reflecting on the role, said that primarily it is public service, assisting people with local constituency issues. So the work that an MHK does with and for their constituents is a really crucial part of the job. Additionally, for many MHKs, they will have government work, either as a minister in the Council of Ministers or as what we call a political member of department. I'm not going to go into that today. It's a little bit analogous to a junior minister. It's an individual who for some purposes is associated with government to provide a bit more political leadership and capacity for a particular department. Additionally, many MHKs sit on committees of the Keys or of Tynwald. For instance, the committee which I know best, the Standing Committee of Tynwald on Constitutional and Legal Affairs and Justice, hears evidence, sets questions and agendas, prepares reports, debates reports in Tynwald. So this is all adding to the mix of work that is required. It's a large and varied role. And what struck us during our research is that, unlike other British Islands legislatures, MHKs do not receive a staffing allowance. And we were struck by how much an MHK does themselves. You will not have your emails read by your MP if you're a constituent. There would have been a filtering process through their staff. Their staff will have been involved in analysing things for them, preparing them, exploring issues for them, organising constituency surgeries, prioritising which constituents to see, all those sorts of things. None of that happens. We were also struck by just how wide-ranging MHK's work was in relation to constituents. In particular, and a point we'll return to later, distressed constituents could frequently look to their MHK as an authority figure who could help in a crisis. And I think it's interesting that recently Induction as MHK has been expanded to include a course on mental health first aid, recognising the range of requests which may be made upon an MHK. And David Cretney in 2021 said, "It's certainly not a 40-hour-a-week job. You have to be prepared to be available at all times." When we gave a version of this talk last year, we were asked to try and give some sort of more concrete sense of how what we've just been discussing in the presentation so far, how that would actually work in somebody's life. And so we talked to an MHK, and they very kindly shared what was literally their typical week. It was the week before we contacted them, and we've made it a bit more anonymous and made it a bit more generic, but this is really drawing upon actual experience. So at least 3 evenings, meetings or functions, including meetings of civil society committees. Monday, departmental meeting, prepare for questions and keys, deal with authorisations and emails, prepare to brief colleagues, lunchtime meeting, demonstration of new technical setup in Douglas, constituency GP surgery in the evening. Tuesday, working breakfast, keys sitting with lunchtime, CPD training, visit constituent on way home. Wednesday, phone calls and messages, update meeting on public sector project, departmental then COMIN meetings, charity event in the evening. Thursday, constituency meeting, then departmental meeting, then calls and emails, constituency and DRAM performance in the evening. Friday, oral evidence session in the morning, departmental business in the afternoon, MANX culture lecture in the evening. Saturday, MANX culture lecture in the afternoon. Sunday, often community volunteering, but this week free. So when we gave the first version of this presentation last year, one comment made to us at this point was, well, you've made a really good case for me not being an MHK. We just explained the demands and some of the problems and the challenges of being an MHK. And really, we want to rectify that a little bit by bringing out the fact that when we've talked to MHKs, They have really stressed what a satisfying job it is, what a positive experience overall it is to be an MHK. And breaking this down a little bit, I've stressed how important it is to be an MHK, the significance of the role. And you can see this as a chance to serve the public. You take on a very demanding but important job that feeds into every aspect of MANX life. Now, this isn't just a generic thing. This isn't the public. This is helping individuals and specific communities in the Isle of Man. So we've mentioned how important the constituency work of an MHK is. Think about the impact that you could have on the life of a constituent who is really struggling, who isn't quite sure how to get through the systems in the Isle of Man, and you can make a real difference for them. Another thing that was identified to us, it's a chance to be deeply engaged in MANX public life, not just political life, but cultural and social life too. And it was stressed to us that this isn't something you may not expect from the formal duties. You may not quite twig the different ways in which you'll find yourself entangled with MANX life, and in particular the life of your constituency. But this was seen as a real privilege associated with the role. And finally, it's a chance to give life to the values upon which the MHK campaigned. If you stood because there were things you really wanted to see taken account of in MANX political life and in MANX laws, then this is a chance for you to bring positive change to the community and ensure that laws serve the needs of MANX people today. So even though a lot of what we've got to say today will make you think twice, we don't want you to think that there are no really positive sides to standing.
There are a lot of myths out there about getting to be an MHK, some of which have a grain of truth to them, and some of which aren't true at all. So let's have a look at 5 of them. Myth number 1. There's no space for new faces. So this is one of these myths that does have an element of truth to it, in the sense that there is something called the incumbent effect. Once a sitting MHK decides to stand again, they almost always have a substantially greater chance of being re-elected than their competition. Now, you find the incumbent effect in all democracies, but studies have found that it's particularly strong in small democracies. The blue line at the top of this graph shows the success rate of incumbent candidates. The orange line underneath it shows the success rate of all candidates. So there's a clear incumbent effect. You're more likely to be elected as an incumbent than you are as a new candidate. However, this only applies to MHKs who decide to run for re-election, and many don't. A large number of MHKs every year choose not to stand for re-election. We've also seen in some elections that the electorate can turn against incumbents, so the incumbency effect does vary. The blue line on this graph shows the number of new MHKs elected after each Isle of Man general election. The orange line underneath it shows the number of new MPs elected after each UK general election, and you can clearly see that the percentage of new politicians elected after a general election in the Isle of Man is normally higher than that in the UK. Myth number 2, women don't get elected. So there are a lot of lines on this graph. The blue line at the top is the number of men standing for election, and the grey line underneath is the number of men who are actually elected. The orange line is the number of women standing for election each year, and the yellow line underneath that is the number of women who are actually elected. So again, the myth that women don't get elected has some truth to it. Until very recently, far more men were elected than women. But you can see from this graph that the biggest reason for the discrepancy between men and women getting elected is that many more men stand for election than women. When you look at the success rate for men and women, it's virtually identical across the century. Once a woman has chosen to stand for election, she has effectively the same chance of being elected as a man standing for election. And in fact, in the 2021 election, the success rate for women was higher than it was for men. Myth number 3, you need to be in a party to succeed. Now, as you can see from this graph, the majority of candidates have always been independent. And in fact, the success rate for party and non-party candidates is very similar. You don't really stand any more chance of success if you stand for a political party. The spikes in 1986 and 1991 are the result of a short experimentation with proportional representation, which meant that a lot more candidates came forward than normal. Nobody quite knew what impact that would have, so more people decided to throw their hat in the ring. And we're going to return to the issue of standing as part of a party a little bit later on. Myth number 4. You need to have always wanted to be an MHK. Now this one is definitely a myth. You don't have to have had long-term political ambitions. Some candidates do, some candidates don't. Of the women politicians we spoke to, some of them had planned to stand for election for years in advance, sometimes in order to save up money for the campaign. But some of them decided to stand as late as 5 or 6 weeks before the election. Now, the political system on the Isle of Man allows you to do that. It allows you to make that decision quite late on. The deadline for submitting nomination papers is only 4 weeks and 1 day before polling day. Now, some of the women we spoke to had been in other forms of elected office, for example, in the local authority or even in legislative council, but others had no political background whatsoever. Myth number 5 is that it's impossible with children. Now, there are definitely challenges to being an MHK when you have children, but many MHKs have children and make it work. Considerations include the need for suitable childcare arrangements, whether that's support from family or friends or an external childcare provider. Childcare was a recurrent issue with the mothers who talked to us. Those with young children in particular had factored in the availability of childcare when they were planning to stand. One candidate told us that they ensured their family member, who would be needed to help with childcare, was on board with their plans to stand for election before they announced their candidacy. And while childcare arrangements are key for all those who have children, and particularly for single parents, childcare arrangements can be more of a concern for women than men, as women often undertake the bulk of the caregiving and household organising. Another concern that the women we spoke to had was how their children and other children might react to negative media coverage about them, and how their children would react to their own actions reflecting on their mother's political standing. Many women also spoke of the pressure to put family first or wait until their children were older, and the definition of older varied considerably from at school to at secondary school to having finished school. The 2022 Commonwealth Parliamentary Association report on effective and inclusive parliaments flagged childcare as an issue on the Isle of Man. Since then, changes to the sitting times and dates have been approved by Tynwald. Sitting times used to be 10:30 a.m. to 8 p.m, but in 2023 these were changed to 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. And in March 2026 it was agreed that there would be no Tynwald sittings during the October and February half-terms. The CPA report noted that in Scotland and Wales, a number of women parliamentarians had recently resigned from their elected roles, citing the impossibility of balancing childcare and political life. It's certainly not impossible to balance the two, but it can be difficult. During the 2023 debate about changes to the sitting dates to avoid sitting during half-term, Laurie Hooper, MHK for Ramsey, noted that there were plenty of good reasons for proposing these changes, but that the core one is trying to remove barriers to people being able to stand and do the job effectively. Many people don't stand in the first place because the job can be incompatible with having a family, which impacts representation. So what are some of the things you might want to consider when you're deciding whether or not to run for election? First of all, you need to make absolutely sure that you're eligible to stand for election. To qualify, you have to be at least 18 years old, you have to be a British citizen or have right to remain, You have to be ordinarily resident and have been for 5 years. Now, it doesn't have to be in a 5-year block. It can be 5 years spread over a longer period of time. And you have to be on the electoral register. Now, you don't have to be on the register for the area in which you intend to stand, but you do have to be on the register in an Isle of Man constituency. If you're not on the electoral register, the deadline to be added is the 27th of July 2026. Now, there's a fairly long list of things that would disqualify you from standing, and it would take far too much time to go into all of these in detail. But if you wonder whether you might fall into one of these categories, then I would encourage you to read the statute. It is worth noting, though, that because the second point on the list here, convicted of a relevant unspent offence, includes offences relating to corruption, bribery and dishonesty, it therefore means that it doesn't just relate to offences that carry prison time. So, for example, a minor theft conviction that was punished with a fine would also disqualify you if that conviction is not spent. An ongoing bankruptcy would disqualify you. And it's worth bearing in mind also that a prison sentence of more than 30 months is never spent. Lesser sentences are normally spent between 1 and 4 years from the end of the sentence. These are some of the people who the women we spoke to discussed their potential candidacy with. Those who were members of a political party discussed the possibility of standing with their party colleagues. It was common to discuss a potential candidacy with family members, whether that be spouses, siblings, parents or children, because the impact on family can be considerable, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. Many of the women we talked to highlighted the importance of having family members on board. And many women also mentioned talking to friends, potentially friends who might help out with a campaign, because it can be really useful to have a team of people helping you during that process. Those women who happened to know sitting MHKs spoke to them to find out more about the role, and if they knew anybody else who had stood as a candidate, even if they hadn't succeeded, these were often useful sources of information as well. There are a number of things that you might want to factor into your decision to stand. It's obviously important to think about what you would want to achieve as a politician, because as a candidate, this will influence what you put in your manifesto. Even if you stand for a political party, you'll need your own manifesto that's relevant to your constituency. And it's worth bearing in mind that it can be more challenging to put together a manifesto if you decide to run late on. But it's also worth noting that in small democracies like the Isle of Man, where many people know each other, personality can be just as important as policy. Of the women that we spoke to, some decided to stand for election because they were dissatisfied with the way in which particular issues were being dealt with by Tynwald. Those issues would feature prominently in their manifesto. Some stood for election because they felt that certain issues weren't being addressed at all. Sometimes that was issues relating to women and children. Others were simply dissatisfied with the existing candidates. Being a politician on the Isle of Man can feel like a 24/7 job. Your constituents will have direct access to you at work and at home. Your home address and phone number will be made public, and Isle of Man constituents are much more likely to know who their political representative is than constituents of larger democracies. In some ways, it's more challenging being a politician in the Isle of Man than it is in the UK. UK politics is more impersonal. People are less likely to know who their MP is. Instead, they might have views on the government or the Prime Minister or particular ministers. On the Isle of Man, you vote in your MHK, not a political party. And when you vote, you're not voting for a Chief Minister because you don't know who is going to become Chief Minister. So it's a very different setup from the UK. You also don't have any staff to help you like you do in the UK. So you're very much at the front, on the front line, dealing with any issues that your constituents might have. Now, the women we spoke to noted the following types of interactions. being approached when you're out shopping or out for a meal, and being asked about constituency issues or the progress of legislation. Having constituents phoning you at all hours of the day and night. Having constituents turn up at your door. Some of the women that we spoke to felt that the only time they could properly relax is when they were on a holiday off island. And again, the impact of this always-on culture can have more of an impact on women where they have primary responsibility for looking after the family. It's worth considering the financial impact of standing for election. The salary of an MHK is good, around £48,000, with access to the government pension scheme. And there's additional pay for additional roles, for example, if you take a ministerial office. And while this might mean a pay rise for some people, for others it means a pay cut. But just as significant as the pay is the fact that this is a really precarious job. If you stand for re-election and lose, you get 6 months severance pay. So you need to consider the longer term impact on your career. Can you easily go back to being, say, a nurse if you've not practiced for 15 years? The impact of standing for election on their family was a real concern among the women we spoke to, and family includes spouses, parents, siblings, not just children. For example, your family may have to get used to you spending less time with them. They may have to answer the door to constituents. They may be with you when you're approached by constituents. They may have to deal with negative press about you. They might have to help more with childcare. They might be expected to attend events with you. And they might have to realise that their actions can reflect on you. For example, what they put on social media. And if you're elected, you become a politically exposed person, and that can also impact on members of your family, as they too, by association, can become politically exposed persons. And this means that they are more exposed to potential bribery or corruption and can lead to enhanced due diligence checks. Because Tynwald isn't dominated by political parties, individual relationships with MHKs become very important. Now, while some members will have party affiliations, essentially what we have is a chamber of independence, so you'll need allies in Tynwald to help you advance your objectives. It's quite an unusual way of working. You have a job, but you don't have a manager. You're accountable instead to your constituents who can challenge you and who can choose not to re-elect you every 5 years, but your colleagues become really important. 2-seat constituencies means that there is another MHK with the same constituents as you do, who's almost certainly not of a different political party than you. And these other MHKs can be a very good ally for you, but remember that they might also be your rival at the next general election. The women MHKs that we talked to felt that there had been an improvement in the collegiality of the keys since the 20th century, and it's unclear to what extent this might relate to improved gender equality within the chamber. Since 2016, there has been greater gender equality in the keys and in Tynwald than there ever has been in the past, though it's worth bearing in mind that there is still a lack of diversity, for example, minority representation. Social media was a key concern for many of the women we talked to, not least in the impact that it might have on their families and especially on their children. Many constituents use social media and comment on other media sites, and despite having much more direct access to politicians than constituents in larger democracies, social media is still an important way in which people engage with their political representatives. And this might be partly because people feel able to say things online that they wouldn't say in person. And of course, using online media can allow people to remain anonymous. So you should be prepared for a significant amount of attention on social media and be prepared for some strong language, particularly if you're a woman. Now, some MHKs don't use social media, but most of them do. And checking social media can be very time consuming. Some MHKs have personal rules about engaging with politics on social media. For example, some MHKs avoid posting about politics completely, except to share details of events. Some respond to social media posts only to correct factual inaccuracies, and only once. Some MHKs get somebody else to occasionally check social media for them, and this means that they're aware of any issues that might come their way in real life. Unfortunately, in real life, there are no real boundaries in terms of access to political representatives for all of the reasons that we've discussed. Now, you can try and mediate this by holding constituency surgeries, but the norms of political engagement, the formalities and having clear boundaries are really much more difficult to maintain in small democracies like the Isle of Man, because you're likely to know many of your constituents in a range of different contexts, and you're likely to encounter them in a range of different settings. So, for example, you might meet them at church, at your children's sporting events, at the co-op checkout, or at your weekly yoga class. And even those constituents that you don't know will still feel that they have access to you 24/7. Now, it's very fortunate that serious incidents are not common on the Isle of Man. Most of the problems occur online, but it is worth considering how you might deal with angry constituents. So, for example, if you are holding constituency surgeries, you might want to do that with the other MHK in your constituency so that you're never in a position where you might be alone with an angry constituent.
So one of the things that was interesting to us is that when we were talking to people during our research project, they would often say, this is something that I wish I'd known when I'd started, or this is something that other people should know about, or you should really tell other candidates this. And so in this section, we're going to pass on some of the tips on how to actually run for the keys once you've decided to stand, which we got from previous candidates and from previous MHKs. There's nothing magical in this. It's exactly what you'd expect to find if we had an established party system where an experienced party colleague would share their experiences with you, or if you happen to know somebody who stood for the keys already. So the cost of running a campaign is quite significant, and really there's two constraints here. One of them is there's a statutory spending cap. There's a limit to how much you can spend on your campaign without committing electoral offences. So you need to be aware of this, and this is the current figure. Numerous politicians you spoke to and candidates suggested that really you need to budget £3,000 for a Keys campaign. So this maximum is not a million miles away from really what you should be anticipating to spend. And this is even making use of friends, family and allies voluntary labour. So the cost of standing was something which a number of people brought out to us. And I just note in passing that in Jersey, until quite recently, every candidate would receive a certain modest amount of campaign funding from the state. And even in Jersey, that's now no longer the case. So the cost of campaigning was a significant constraint on some prospective candidates and something to think about when you're planning your campaign. So I've mentioned the idea of obligations upon you, legal obligations upon you as a candidate, and I just want to flesh this out a bit more. You become a prospective candidate long before you do your formal nomination papers. You become a prospective candidate when you declare your intention to be a candidate at the next election, or when another person with your consent declares your intention to do so. If you do this more than 12 months before the election, and some people do, you don't become a prospective candidate until 12 months before election day. Now, being a prospective candidate puts a number of obligations on you, and at the end of this session we'll have some links to key resources. But for example, you need to keep track of donations. You need to keep track of election expenses. You need to avoid working with an unregistered party. As part of your process, you must appoint an election agent. They have a number of quite onerous obligations themselves. Can be you, can be another person, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But one thing I do want to say a little bit more about is the third point on the slide, avoiding working with an unregistered party. So what do we mean by an unregistered party? The Elections, Keys and Local Authorities Act 2020 requires political parties to be registered, and candidates and prospective candidates commit an offence if they accept the support or endorsement of an unregistered party. So we have a system where political parties are registered, and there's quite a lot of obligations on them in terms of transparency and probity and things like that. There are currently only 3 registered political parties: the Isle of Man Green Party, the Manx Labour Party, and Liberal Vannin. So as a prospective candidate, you should not accept the support or endorsement of a party which is not registered, and currently there are only 3 registered. Now, as to whether there is time between now and the general election to register a political party and then accept its support, there isn't a specified schedule for the process, I'm afraid. It's been a number of years since the party was last registered. I've had a chat with the elections team. They have made the point that ultimately it's the Attorney General who makes a decision about whether or not an application to register should be accepted. And as we come towards the end of a Keys term, it's not unusual for the AG to be very busy with a final push to finalise legislation. So if you are thinking of launching a new party and standing for it as one of its candidates, I'd really recommend look into this with the elections team as soon as possible and really make your priority the registration of the party, because if you don't register, you can't refer to the support or endorsement of the party. The next tip we got was to use nominations strategically. Now, when you look at the paperwork and the forms for standing, you'll see that you need 2 electors to nominate you, a proposer and a seconder, but your nomination must be backed by a further 20 electors. The temptation is to get the paperwork sorted out by those closest to you who you know support you. It's only human nature. This is a nerve-wracking process. You want to go to people who will say, of course, I'm really happy to nominate you. Best of luck. I'm really keen to support you. But it was pointed out to us that that's actually missing a trick. You will know people in the constituency you're running for. Your friends who you are tempted to approach to sign for you may know a lot of the same people. And so there may be voters in your constituency who you don't have a particular connection to. And your nominators, if it's a narrow pool, won't have a particular connection to. So one suggestion is using the nomination process to talk to a broader range of people and see if once they know you and what you want to stand for, they would wish to nominate you. They are then in a position through their own social networks to act as ambassadors to constituents who they know, but you don't. So using nominations strategically can be a way to increase knowledge of you and support for you in the constituency. One of the distinctive features of the Manx political landscape is the importance of the doorstep, knocking on doors by the candidate themselves. And really everybody we talk to stress this as being something you absolutely had to do, and if you didn't want to do this or didn't want to put yourself in this position, it'd be very difficult to be elected. So they've really stressed the importance of that doorstep interaction. And very unusually, certainly from a perspective of, say, a UK party, it's expected you knock on every door yourself. Not that you have a member of your team do it, but that you do it. And it was suggested to us this is particularly true in the more rural constituencies, where, of course, the time taken to cover every doorstep may be greater. It's time consuming and it can be physically demanding. One participant said they'd worn out 2 pairs of shoes in a single campaign. Our participants described it as an overwhelmingly positive experience. They got to talk to the people that they wished to represent, to get a sense of what was important to them, to make a connection with them as a person, as an individual. So even though it's time consuming, physically demanding, and you do need to be aware of security implications, it was seen as a very positive part of the Manx political process. One suggestion was that you need to really be strategic and well organised. Check the electoral register, note where you've been, on the basis that it's better to have tried everybody than to have seen half the constituents twice. One thing we would pull out from our project is that men and women have different door knocking experiences. There was a suggestion that our women candidates in particular felt that they needed to be aware of security and safety issues when they were knocking on doors. And their feeling was that male candidates didn't necessarily feel the same. And actually some male candidates felt that it was important to make sure that they were aware of feelings of vulnerability when they knock on the door. So for instance, knocking on the door and then taking a couple of steps back. So you haven't got this strange man looming over you when you open the door. The question of vulnerability on the campaign trail is not unique to the Isle of Man. I do think the individual nature of MANX politics, the emphasis on the doorstep, make it a special challenge, and you might want to be aware of movements in the UK, for instance around the Joe Cox Foundation, which are concerned about the vulnerability of political figures, including people campaigning. You also need to think about your social media strategy. Back in 2021, David North said, "If I was standing for Keys now, the first question to ask anybody is, are you on social media? If they are not today, then they are out of it." One of the surprising findings we made is that despite the very intimate nature of political life in the Isle of Man, social media is incredibly important. And one suggestion made to us was, because mainstream media doesn't necessarily have quite the same traction as it does in larger democracies, social media has flowed into the gap. So you are going to need a social media strategy. One thing I would point out is that the Code of Practice for Election Materials applies to social media and websites. It's quite easy to think, oh, it's only a blue sky post, it's only a quick message on Facebook. As per the Code of Practice, candidates should display their full names and addresses on their social media profile, websites and emails. Candidates can include a shortened link to a social media post, but must include the full link on any paid for social media advertising, and government social media accounts should not be utilised for any advertising purposes. Because social media is such an integrated part of most people's lives, being aware of the need to keep an eye on the formalities for it is difficult. Even seasoned MHKs sometimes get this wrong and are criticised for doing so. So think about your social media strategy. What platforms do I use? What approach do I want to take? But really be aware that it is part of your election campaign and so is regulated by the Code of Practice. You also need, although it may feel a bit old-fashioned to some, a postal strategy. Now, the Code of Practice for Election Materials applies to things that are put through people's letterbox and posted as well, but additionally there is some financial support available. At the time of this presentation, the state will deliver one leaflet or manifesto per house. You can obtain a copy of the electoral register once you are a declared candidate, and you'll need to think about, what do you want to post, what do you want to hand deliver, will you have help to stuff and label envelopes? This sounds really prosaic, but it was something brought home to us by a number of candidates. The labour involved in this is quite considerable. Some people talked about getting friends and family to sort of rally around the kitchen table and just spend endless evenings stuffing envelopes. Others used professional services on the Isle of Man to do these sort of bulk mail shots. A couple of candidates talked about having a "sorry you were out when I called" leaflet, which the candidate could put through when they've knocked on a door but not managed to get through. And they felt this sort of flagged to the person they've missed, look, you are important to me, and also helped them identify channels for communication if there's something they really want to talk about, having missed the candidate. So these are, to varying degrees, remote strategies, postal strategies, social media, and the door knocking is pretty much one-to-one. You know, you may have multiple voters in a house, but you may simply be speaking to one person. There is provision for organised events in which you can address a number of prospective voters at once, and we're very fortunate to have Dave Martin make a contribution. He very kindly not only spoke in the night, but has also very kindly agreed to record his session separately. And so the next slide will switch to Dave Martin, who will begin by introducing himself.
Good evening. My name is Dave Martin. I'm Captain of the Parish of Andreas and Secretary of the Captains of the Parish Association. And I'm here this evening to very briefly explain pre-election hustings meetings in the Isle of Man. Of course, candidates can arrange their own meetings, and media outlets sometimes arrange debates between candidates, but I'm here to explain the series of official, independently chaired meetings that take place across the island in the run-up to the general election. Attendance by candidates at these independently chaired pre-election hustings meetings is not compulsory, but voters may of course draw their own conclusions if candidates do not attend to explain their position and answer questions publicly. For well over a century, these meetings have taken place, one per parish, organised and run by the captain of each parish. We organise meetings at the request of 12 parishioners, hence they are known as requisition meetings. There are no longer captains of the towns, so local authorities now have an equivalent role in Douglas and Ramsey. This year, for the first time, there are also one per constituency pre-election meetings being organised by the elections team in the Cabinet Office in accordance with the Elections, Keys and Local Authorities Amendment Act 2026, which did receive royal assent on Monday, and the subsequent regulations, which will shortly appear on the Tynwald Register of Business. Because of this potential overlap, some meetings may be jointly organised and run by a captain of the parish and the Cabinet Office. In terms of dates, these meetings do not start immediately after nominations close. Instead, they will take place in the second and third weeks of September to allow time for candidates to get their manifestos out to the voters. To help candidates planning, a list of dates for these meetings will be published jointly between the Cabinet Office and the captains of the parish at the earliest opportunity, certainly well before nomination day. And then the person chairing each meeting will then be in contact as soon as possible after nominations close to confirm arrangements for their meeting. As I say, these meetings are independently chaired, so exact arrangements may vary very slightly between meetings, but in general the procedure is pretty much the same, with the aim of ensuring equal opportunity for all candidates. These meetings will all take place in the evening, starting at 7 o'clock and finishing at 9 o'clock prompt. The meetings will start with each candidate having the opportunity to deliver a short address explaining their platform and views, and there will then be questions principally from the floor of the meeting, but may also include questions submitted in writing to the chair. Candidates can pass and decline to answer a question, but that means foregoing their chance to answer. On completion of questions, candidates will have an opportunity to deliver a brief summation as to why they feel that they deserve to be elected. In terms of timing, within the meeting, the time available for each candidate's opening remarks will typically be a maximum of 5 minutes, but may be adjusted beforehand at the chair's discretion once the number of candidates standing in a constituency is known. So, when you're contacted by the person chairing a meeting, they will confirm how long you will get for your initial and closing statements. And in all of this, timing will be enforced to maximise equality of opportunity. And if you go over time, the chair may just cut you off. Speaking order, candidates will deliver their opening address in surname alphabetical order. When it comes to questions, candidates will answer in surname order again, but with the first to answer rotating, and similarly for closing statements. The chair will do their utmost to ensure an orderly meeting with no heckling or interruptions. If that happens, the chair will suspend the meeting and can, if necessary, ask the person or persons concerned to leave the hall. This applies to candidates as well, and candidates must remember that these meetings are not debates. Just in terms of technology, the meetings are purely spoken word, there's no PowerPoint presentations and so on. Some meetings may be recorded or streamed, and some meetings may use a public address system to ensure that all in the hall can hear both those on the platform and questions from those attending the meeting. These meetings may, if you're a first-time candidate, sound a little daunting, but they're organised and structured to try and allow all candidates an equal opportunity. And so, on behalf of all those who will be chairing these meetings, we look forward to working with you to hold meetings that run smoothly to the benefit of both the electorate and the candidates. Thank you.
We're going to finish this section just with a link to the guidance for candidates issued by the Cabinet Office. This has been updated for 2026. I suspect if there are any final changes to regulations, etc., they will be incorporated into this live document as well. So it's the bang up to date official guide to being a candidate for the general election. When you go to it, you'll see it covers a wide range of practical issues. We've introduced them in this presentation to help you think through whether you want to stand, but this is really your go-to resource once you have decided to stand. And it covers not only everything we've talked about, but other issues, for instance, registering as a data controller, what actually happens on election day, and crucially, the process of appointing an election agent and what the election agent is responsible for. So, if at the end of this process you've decided, I'm going to go for it, I'm going to be standing for the keys for the September election, this is a fantastic resource. So great that we've highlighted it ahead of the resources we're about to talk to in the future slides. So we're going to finish the presentation with a link to further resources. We start close to home, materials available in the Isle of Man about the general election in the Isle of Man in particular, and then we're going to move a bit further afield, in particular looking at materials from Jersey and the UK, which may be useful for you in different ways. So this slide has links to guidance from the Cabinet Office. These are all live links as of today. What I would particularly point out is that the Crown and Elections team in the Cabinet Office are very happy to talk to candidates, prospective candidates, those considering getting involved. So if you have specific questions, please do email them. They are very happy to help with this part of the process. Beyond the Isle of Man, you could consider looking at materials generated around Jersey elections. Now, Jersey has a big election year this year as well. The materials I have here are actually references to their previous election. So they have a page run by an organisation called Vote.j, Vote for Jersey, about standing for election there. There's a useful video on why you might want to stand. There is a video explaining some of the issues around social media for election candidates in Jersey. Now, Jersey is not the Isle of Man, but it is a small democracy. It has a relatively small number of candidates. It has a relatively intimate social network connection. So I think there is some interesting points made here. And if you're interested in how other people approach these things, there is a whole playlist of video manifestos from Jersey candidates. I found this particularly interesting. The link is for 2022 general election candidates. They too have a general election 2026, so keep an eye open for new recordings coming forward to see how other people approach some of the same communication issues that you'll be wrestling with. Turning to the UK, there is not the same emphasis on supporting independence in the national legislature as we'll find in, say, Jersey or in the Isle of Man, but something not dissimilar can be found at local government level. Independent councillors are far more common than independent MPs. So there's a link here to the local government association's guidance on how to become a councillor, which I think is quite interesting. Being a UK councillor is not the same as being an MHK, but there's some interesting ideas there, I think. And then turning to particular kinds of candidate, there is a national campaign called Elect Her, which is focusing on encouraging women candidates to come forward and be elected. There is something called Operation Black Vote, which is aimed at the BAME community. And in particular, within that, they have a discussion about encouraging and supporting BAME candidates. Again, in the UK system, but again, some interesting lessons there, I think. And then the Disability Policy Centre, which has a very wide range of different work, they also have a discussion about representation and disabled candidates. So you need to take all of these with a pinch of salt. They're not MANX, they're the UK. You need to Manxify them, but they may give you some interesting ideas. And then finally, and furthest afield, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. The CPA is something which has a really, really good rep in small democracies. I've been really struck talking to people from Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, how valuable connections, links, training, events that they find with the CPA actually are. So there is an online course run by the CPA. They call it the Induction for New Parliamentarians. It's aimed at candidates as well. They do charge for it. It's £125. Again, you would need to Manxify it. It's a 5-hour online course, something to consider, in particular if you're feeling that you're not quite getting enough sort of the gist and the support that you need from the resources that we've talked about today. The CPA is a global organisation which has very diverse members. It has two networks I'd like to point you towards. One of them is a regional one. So the CPA has a British Islands and Mediterranean region network, and there's a link there. So that is, if you like, European members of the CPA. And then they have a small branches, which is a network focused on small democracies like the Isle of Man. The Cayman Islands is not the Isle of Man, and yet it has some of the same challenges, some of the same opportunities as the Isle of Man does, for instance. So the small branches network is bringing these smaller members of the CPA together to share lessons and share insights. So that is all we wanted to cover in this presentation. I hope you found it useful. We certainly found that having done this project on women in Manx politics, there were future implications from it that you hadn't really twigged going in. So we're particularly pleased to have a chance to share some of the insights from that work with really people today, which hopefully will be useful for you going forward. So thank you for your time. For those of you who hoped to attend virtually, but our technical problems meant we couldn't, thank you very much for your patience. I hope you find this recording useful. If there's anything about this session you want to talk about, please email me or Katrina, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much.